One of the main sources of conflict around people trying to develop offshore wind farms is concerns about the effects on tourism and recreation onshore. Most of the research around tourism and recreation has focused on visual aspects for beachgoers and whether or not people will want to come to the beach or stay away from the beach depending on how the wind farms have been developed. We thought you should take a different approach and look at tourism and recreation from a broader viewpoint and understanding that all of tourism and recreation in the coastal areas isn't all about going to the beach, but that there are lots of different activities and many different perspectives that people take in thinking about tourism and recreation and how it might interact with offshore energy developments. So in this project we took a multiple methods approach where we were using several different qualitative methods to try to understand people's responses to the wind farm. So those included looking at documents and the media and how the project was being portrayed in the media. Then we did some what's called participant observation, where we actually had people out in the field talking to people, participating in tourism and recreation activities, and listening in to see how people interacted with the wind farm as they saw it and as they described it. And then we also did focus groups with people who were involved in different tourism and recreation sectors. And so we had different findings from each of those bits and pieces. So there is a question about whether or not the wind farms are increasing tourism or not. And one of the things that we heard is that because it is novel, right, because it's new, it's the first wind farm in the United States, that there probably are people who have come to southern Rhode Island or to Block Island just to see the wind farm. I don't know how big that group is. Most of the people that we talked to really talked about it in terms of it being an enhancement to the current tourism or recreation experience. That is, maybe they're out boating for the day, they like boating in that area, and they'll swing by and see the turbines. Or a charter fishing captain might say, well, the fish aren't biting today in our usual spot, let's try the wind farm. Or the fish aren't biting today, let's swing by the wind farm and take a look at it. So it's really this sort of extra experience into visiting the area. One of the things that was really nice about this project is we had a project advisory board that was comprised of academics, people who were involved in the tourism and recreation industry, both in Rhode Island and on the island itself, and people who were community members on the island. And so they had an opportunity to interact with us both in terms of what were the interesting questions, as well as being able to take back some of our findings to the community as well. So the Block Island project is special. There's a couple of things that make it special. One is it is very small. It's often characterized as a pilot project. And so our findings are really specific to that project in and of itself. One of the unique things about Block Island is it functions almost as what's sometimes called a near-shore project, in that it's only 3 miles off the coast of Block Island. So we were able to hear what people's experience was both living on the island and going to the island as a visitor, but then also it is an offshore wind farm from mainland Rhode Island, and we were able to talk to people who live on the mainland as well. Those experiences from the mainland actually transfer pretty well to some of the other proposals for offshore wind farms in the United States, where the wind farm will be 15, 20 miles offshore. So the experiences that people have had on the mainland will be very similar to the kinds of experiences that they will have to some of these other wind farms that are further offshore. There are a couple of things that are really important from the perspective of future development for offshore wind farms in the United States. One is that we were actually working under a contract from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. So for them, they're involved in all of these projects that are going to be taking place in federal waters as opposed to state waters like the Block Island wind farm. So this gives them information on things that they should be thinking about and looking at in terms of how these projects could impact or affect other communities that are out there. So for me personally, my background is really in understanding how people interact with the environment and how they're affected by things that happen in their environment. So for me, being able to listen to people talk about the experience that they had with offshore wind and with renewable energy being developed in the ocean space, which is very new for us here in this country, was really an opportunity to hear how they experience it, how it influences their attitudes, and what their expectations were for how they want to engage with it or be involved in future decision making. One of the indicators that we found most interesting was about how people within the tourism and recreation industry are actually engaged with decision making around the project. So there were a couple of things that were very interesting about that and that were somewhat unexpected. One, we talk about no one being tabula rasa, the blank slate, is that people were experiencing the wind farm in a way that related to how they had experienced the development process themselves. So if they were someone who felt good about how the process of developing the wind farm had taken place, they tended to have a more positive experience. If it's someone who felt like the experience was not a good one, they were really looking for negatives about the project. So that was important. One of the things that was really lacking around the Block Island wind farm was baseline information about tourism and recreation. And one of the things that our study pointed out for these other communities that are looking at offshore wind in their region is that it is very important, if you want to really know how tourism and recreation are affected, is that you really do collect some of that data before planning and construction begin so that you have something to compare it to. One of the things that we really need to do is stop thinking of the public or tourists as being this big, single, monolithic group, but really need to start looking at individual groups who engage in certain kinds of activities and trying to understand in more detail how offshore wind affects or might affect their experience. Most of my research is really about how people interact with offshore wind in a number of different ways. So we have spent a lot of time thinking about Block Island. It's for those of us at the University of Rhode Island, Block Island Wind Farm has been a terrific laboratory for understanding how people think and interact with this technology. Where I'm looking now is really trying to get my students and the people I collaborate with to think beyond Block Island and trying to understand how people interact in different contexts and in different places with this technology.